Good evening, everyone. I hope that you still have energy left to go through this session. Honorable members of the German government, Dr. Siegfried Rusmov, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Honorable members of the B7, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It is an honor for me, on behalf of the Senegalese government, to participate at this TDI this year. I would like to thank Dr. Siegfried for the invitation and for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, this gathering comes at a time of difficult macroeconomics and social conditions, making us rethink whether globalization has benefited the African continent. The pandemic and the crisis in Ukraine have further shown us the unevenness of resilience and recovery, evidenced by the restriction on access to vaccines and effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policies, among others. For example, the pandemic has also highlighted how interconnected the world is today and how one event in one part of the world has rippling effects on another part as a byproduct of globalization. Why I believe that the globalization has had a positive impact in the global economy, including in Africa, we need to recognize that much progress still needs to happen. Africa has much suffered from the negative effects of globalization, such as, for example, those of climate change, the COVID pandemic, and the war in Ukraine. There have been heavy reliance on limited suppliers of energy, for example. This has led to drastic increase of oil and gas prices. Africa's heavy reliance on one supplier for wheat and fertilizer, for example, within a globalized framework is a big issue today. For Senegal, the impact of the Ukraine crisis on our budget is equivalent today to 3.2% of GDP. Because of the increase on energy prices and food prices and fertilizer. At the same time, we know that the continent today, with its 1.4 billion people and its $2.6 trillion GDP, accounts only for 3% of global trade, while a country like Singapore, for example, with 5.6 million people and $400 billion of GDP only, accounts for 6% of world trade. We'll come to that later, I'm sure. It's because also Africa is not adding value to its products and is not itself really trading with itself. We hope that the new agreement, the continental free trade area, will help us resolve that issue. Africa, as you know, is living a democratic boom that will create the next global center with the world's largest market in 2050, with 2.5 billion consumers, mainly young people. And that is an opportunity of growth for your industries. We know also it is a challenge for us. Africa is over 30 million square kilometers, big enough to fit all G7 countries, to fit China, to fit India, and we will still have some space left. This means that we really need massive investments in infrastructure. If you have that landmass, the infrastructure gap is brutal, and we need to work together to really help resolve that gap. I'll just talk about 3 important issues for us. Number 1, to resolve those issues, we need to front-load investments. Today in Africa, every year, we invest give or take about 40 to 50 billion in infrastructure. But the gap is 130 to 180 billion dollars, which means then we need to front load investments, which means then things that we are waiting to do in 50 years' time need to be done in 10, 15 years' time if we want to make the world a better place, if we want to create more markets and more opportunities for your own companies, for B7 companies. It will build the resilience of the continent against many crises. Manufacturing, for example, now in Senegal and in other African countries, COVID vaccines and other vaccines is an example of front-loading. It's a $220 million investment with the government, the European Union, the European team, the US with DFC, the IFC, that will help us be a hub for vaccine production, and this is critical. Projects such as, for example, the Dakar-Tambacounda and Kédougou Rail. It's a $3 to $4 billion rail project, which we must execute if we are to take the thousands of trucks off the road and make the environment better. And that requires massive investments, and the private sector alone cannot do it. The government has to build the trucks and work with the private sector, your private sector, for example, to exploit that rail, which is critical for Senegal and critical in West Africa. But for that, we need cheaper financing, longer-term, innovative financial instruments to work also with the private sector. There is a need to mutualize initiatives such as the Global Gateway, the B3W led by the US, called now, I understand, the Global Infrastructure, to really mutualize and work together so that we can raise the funding necessary, which is available on the market, and co-execute those projects with B7 companies and African companies. Co-execution is key. We want to work with your companies, for example, as EPC contractors, to execute those massive projects, but in partnership with our companies as well. Today, the export credit market, for example, the rules, the terms are not in line with the funding required for our different projects. So we need to have blended finance, what we call blended export credit finance with your companies. One last thing on energy transition. It's very important for Africa to exploit its gas, to not only industrialize, but also to be an alternative supplier for Europe and for other countries. Senegal, for example, is investing heavily in renewable energy. Our energy mix is 30% today renewable energy. We want to do, for example, hydro projects. But the financing available today makes the tariff higher and making the consumers pay a higher tariff. Can we mobilize blended finance to make that tariff more acceptable for us? I think we can do that if we work together, G7 countries with their B7 companies and our companies working together to advance all those initiatives. In 2050, 20 years from now, when our children and grandchildren will read the history books, they will see what we have done today, what we are deciding today, and I hope that we will be bold in mobilizing capital, resources, technology, know-how for Africa, for B7 countries, and for the world. Thank you very much.